I never liked funerals, but this one felt heavier than all the others, not because of the black-draped cathedral or the slow tolling of the bells, but because of the way people's eyes flickered toward each other instead of toward the coffin. I stood in the very last row, my back pressed against the cold stone pillar, watching the scene unfold with the quiet detachment of someone who already knew the truth. No one in that room had come to mourn. They had come to divide. The air smelled of lilies, heavy and artificial, mixed with the sweet sting of candle wax. It was supposed to be solemn, but underneath the incense, I sensed something sharper, metallic almost, like the hidden tang of blood. The board of directors, dressed in perfect black suits with silk ties, leaned toward each other in whispered exchanges. Their faces were smooth, composed, but their eyes betrayed them. Not grief, not loss. Calculation. They weren't burying a man. They were waiting for the ground to be clear so they could bury each other in paperwork and signatures. I adjusted my coat sleeve, trying to hide the tremor in my hand. No one was looking at me. To them, I was invisible. Just another staff member clinging to the edge of this company like ivy on stone. They didn't know, and I wasn't about to remind them. Not yet. The coffin rested at the front of the cathedral, polished oak with silver handles, guarded by two solemn ushers. I should have been closer, should have been among the people who could claim the right to grieve openly, but I stayed in the shadows. Part of me wanted to walk down the aisle, place a hand on that wood, whisper something only he and I would understand. But another part of me knew that every step forward would draw eyes, and every eye in this place was dangerous. I remembered the last time I had seen him alive. Just one day before, in his office on the top floor, where the afternoon sun fell across the bookshelves and the city hummed below. He looked tired, his hair a little grayer, but his voice was steady. "Keeley," he had said, his eyes locking on mine with an intensity I still feel in my bones. "I've made arrangements. You'll understand soon." Then he reached into his desk and handed me a leather folder. It was heavier than it looked, and for a moment, I thought it was just another stack of contracts or reports he wanted me to organize. I carried it home, placed it on my kitchen counter, and only later that night, when I finally opened it, did I realize what it was. 50%. Half of the company. Signed, notarized, sealed. My breath had caught in my throat, and I remember pressing the papers back into the folder as though they burned. He had entrusted me with something unthinkable, something that could shift the entire balance of power in this empire. But before I could even decide what to do, the next morning brought the news. He was gone. A heart attack, they said. Unexpected. Tragic. Sudden. Now, standing in the back of that cathedral, I kept that secret buried deep inside. If anyone even suspected I held those documents, they would tear me apart. The board members weren't grieving. They were already rehearsing their strategies. I could almost hear their thoughts. Who would take the chairmanship? How would the shares be redistributed? Which alliances needed to be formed before the reading of the will? I glanced at them one by one. Mr. Grayson, with his pale, calculating smile, had built his fortune in acquisitions that left whole departments gutted. Mrs. Caldwell, her diamonds catching the candlelight, leaned in close to whisper something to him, her expression cool and amused. Further down the row, Martin Ellis, who had once tried to push me out of a project for lack of experience, tapped his phone under the pew, his lips tightening, as if the funeral were nothing more than an inconvenient break between meetings. They all looked so composed, so professional, but I had seen the way their faces changed in private boardrooms when numbers and power were at stake. There was nothing sacred to them except control. The priest's voice droned on, talking about legacy, about leadership, about how the departed had built not just a company, but a community. I almost laughed at the hypocrisy of it. The only community in this room was one of vultures circling a fresh carcass. When the choir began to sing, I slipped outside for air. The sky was gray, the kind of colorless September sky that makes the world look drained. I pressed my hand against the leather bag at my side, where the folder rested. My secret, my shield, my weapon. I leaned against the cold stone wall of the cathedral and let myself remember. He had been more than a CEO to me. He had been a mentor, sometimes even a protector. When I first joined the company, young and unsure, he had noticed me when no one else did. He had defended me when others dismissed me. He had told me once, "You're sharper than you think, Kelly." Never let them convince you otherwise. Those words had stayed with me through every slight, every dismissal, every time a board member looked through me as if I were furniture. And now he was gone, and all I had left was that folder. I could have revealed it then. I could have walked back inside, stood at the pulpit, and announced to the world that I was the rightful owner of half the company. The shock on their faces would have been delicious. But I didn't, because I wasn't naive enough to think they would accept it. The battle wouldn't end with applause. It would begin with war. So I stayed silent. The funeral ended with polite applause for the choir and stiff handshakes at the cathedral doors. I watched from a distance as the board members slipped into sleek black cars, their drivers already waiting with engines humming. They didn't linger, didn't embrace, didn't shed tears. To them, the death of the man in the coffin was nothing more than the opening move in a new game. I walked home through the city streets, my heels clicking against the pavement, my thoughts loud in my head. People passed me without a glance, and that suited me. Let the world believe I was nobody. Let the board believe I was disposable. I had something they didn't know existed, and that ignorance was the only advantage I had. That night, I spread the documents out on my kitchen table again. My hands trembled as I touched the embossed seals, the signatures, the clauses written in precise legal language. It was real. It was mine. I whispered the words to myself, half in disbelief, 50%. But instead of relief, I felt fear, because I knew what came next. They would come for me, sooner or later, and when they did, I had to be ready. For now, I would wait. I would play the role they had written for me, the quiet assistant, the invisible girl in the back row, the one they thought could be discarded. But inside, I was holding half of their empire. And when the moment came, when they finally turned on me, I would be ready to say the words that had been burning inside me since the moment I walked out of that cathedral. We'll see each other again. The first few days after the funeral felt like a strange blur, as if I were walking through glass corridors where no one could see me. I went to the office because habit told me I had to, but the air was different now. Before, people would stop by my desk, ask about schedules, slide papers across for review. Now they walked past me as if I were nothing more than furniture. No greetings, no questions, not even a glance. On Tuesday morning, I sat with my coffee, waiting for the board secretary to bring me the usual folder of reports. She brushed past my desk without stopping, her heels clicking briskly against the marble floor. A week ago, she had smiled at me, even whispered gossip about one of the directors. Now, she didn't even bother to acknowledge I existed. I told myself I didn't care. That invisibility was safer. But it still hurt. Each passing day, I felt myself erased. The assistant whose presence had once been necessary was now treated like an empty chair. At first, I thought maybe they were grieving in their own way, too distracted to notice me. But grief doesn't look like mocking smiles in hallways or conversations that fall silent when you approach. Grief doesn't look like deliberate exclusion from meetings I had always attended. By Thursday, I realized the truth. They weren't distracted. They were erasing me, piece by piece. That morning, when I walked into the glass conference room for the weekly financial review, I found my usual chair already occupied. Mr. Ellis sat there, his phone resting on the table, smirking as though daring me to challenge him. I stood for a moment, unsure if I should ask him to move. Then Mrs. Caldwell, her pearls gleaming in the fluorescent light, tilted her head and said sweetly, "Oh, Kaylee, we didn't expect you today." This is a director's session. A week ago, I would have been invited without question. A week ago, my notes and summaries had been considered essential. Now, they stared at me like an intruder. I smiled faintly, as if I hadn't noticed the dismissal in her tone. "I'll just listen," I murmured. But Mr. Grayson, the oldest and perhaps the coldest among them, tapped his pen against the table and said, "No need. We'll manage without you." Something sharp pierced my chest, but I kept my face still. I turned and walked out of the room as though it didn't matter. Behind me, I heard the muffled sound of laughter, the kind people let slip when they think you've been defeated. I wanted to slam the door, to throw their arrogance back at them, to scream that half this company already belonged to me. But instead, I walked calmly back to my desk, opened my laptop, and began typing notes no one had asked me to write. They thought I was powerless. Let them. That night, I stayed late at the office, the building nearly empty, the city lights glowing through the tall windows. I pulled the leather folder from my bag and spread the documents across the desk. 50%, half the company. The signatures gleamed under the desk lamp, but half wasn't enough. Not yet. With 50%, I could block decisions, disrupt their plans, but I couldn't control the board. To win, I needed 51. Just one more percent. That was the difference between defense and victory, and I knew exactly what that meant. Somewhere, among the minor shareholders, among the quiet voices who never made headlines, was someone holding that golden percentage, someone whose loyalty I would need to secure before I revealed anything. The next morning, Friday, the official summons arrived. An email, short and cold. Board meeting. Attendance required. I knew what it meant even before I walked into that glass room at noon. The atmosphere was suffocating. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward me as I entered. Their expressions were rehearsed, polite but firm, the kind of faces people wear when they think they are about to deliver a fatal blow. Mr. Grayson cleared his throat. "Kelly," he began, "we appreciate your service to the company. However, in light of recent events, the board has decided that your position is no longer necessary." The words hit me like a stone, but I kept my face neutral. Mrs. Caldwell added, with false sympathy dripping from her voice, "You understand, don't you? Things must change now. Streamlining, efficiency, new directions. You'll be fine." I almost laughed at the absurdity. Streamlining? Efficiency? They weren't firing me to streamline. They were firing me because they thought I was alone, defenseless, disposable. Martin Ellis leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Of course, we'll provide a small severance." Out of respect for your years of assistance. The way he emphasized the word assistance made my stomach clench. They thought it was over. They thought I was finished. I looked around the table, meeting each of their eyes in turn. They expected tears. They expected pleading. They expected me to beg for a chance to stay. Instead, I smiled. Just slightly. Calm. Controlled. "Thank you for your decision," I said quietly, my voice steady. "I'll collect my things." Their relief was palpable. A few of them even chuckled, as though they had finally rid themselves of a nuisance. But inside me, something sharp and unshakable solidified. Let them laugh. Let them believe I was nothing. Because when the time came, when I held that extra 1%, I would walk back into this room and watch their laughter went in their lips. For now, I left the room without another word, my heels clicking against the marble floor. Behind me, I could hear muffled whispers, even a stifled laugh. They thought they had won, but the truth was simple. I already held half their empire. And soon, with just one more piece, the entire game would belong to me. When I got home that evening, I didn't bother turning on the lights right away. I dropped my bag on the floor and leaned against the door, listening to the muffled silence of my apartment. It was strange how quiet the world could feel when your entire life had just been reduced to nothing in the eyes of people who thought they held all the power. I stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness, before finally crossing to the table where the leather folder still rested. It had been there for days, untouched except for the nights when I pulled it out, just to reassure myself it was real. 50%. Half the company. Proof that I wasn't as powerless as they believed. But tonight, I needed more than reassurance. Tonight, after the humiliation of being dismissed like a useless secretary, I needed answers. I opened the folder carefully, spreading the documents across the table. At first glance, they looked like the same contracts and shareholder agreements I had already examined. But deeper in the stack, behind the share transfer certificate, were other papers. Thick files with notes in the director's handwriting, neat but quick, as though written in haste. I pulled them closer, my fingers trembling slightly. The first page made my breath catch. Unauthorized bonuses. A table of names, directors I had just faced hours earlier, next to figures so large I had to blink to be sure I was reading correctly. Millions siphoned off under vague labels like consulting fees and strategic retention incentives. The signatures at the bottom of the approval forms were theirs, clear and damning. I flipped to the next file. Foreign accounts. Detailed transfers to shell companies in jurisdictions I knew too well. Places where money disappears behind veils of secrecy. Each transaction traced, each note cross-referenced with internal memos. He had collected everything. Then another. Conflicts of interest. Contracts awarded to relatives. Inflated invoices. Advisory services from companies that existed only on paper. Names I recognized. Dates I remembered. Deals that had been celebrated as victories in board meetings suddenly exposed as theft. I sat back in my chair, stunned. He had left me more than shares. He had left me ammunition. The late CEO, my mentor, the only man in that building who had ever truly seen me, had prepared for this. He had known what would happen after his death. He had known the board would circle like vultures, eager to carve up what he had built. And he had known that I, invisible little Kelly, would be the one holding the knife they never saw. I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering him. He wasn't an easy man. He had been sharp, demanding, relentless in his expectations, but he had also been fair. When others dismissed me as nothing more than a quiet assistant, he gave me responsibilities no one else would have trusted me with. When I made mistakes, he corrected me without cruelty, and when I succeeded, he acknowledged it in ways that mattered more than praise. I remembered the last time he spoke to me privately, his voice lower than usual, his gaze unusually gentle. "They will underestimate you, Kelly," he had said. "That will be your greatest advantage. Never fight them on their terms. Let them laugh. Let them think you are small. And then, when the time comes, you will already be standing where they never imagined you could reach." At the time, I thought he was simply trying to encourage me. Now, reading these documents, I realized he had been preparing me. I ran my fingers over his handwriting, the precise strokes of his pen. He had written notes in the margins, reminders, warnings, little observations about each director. Caldwell, loyalty only to profit. Ellis, reckless, careless with documents. Grayson, old but shrewd, watch him closely. Each line felt like he was still speaking to me, guiding me. The files weren't just records, they were a map of weaknesses, of secrets, of traps waiting to be sprung. For hours, I sat there, reading, annotating, piecing together the patterns. The company wasn't simply corrupt in hidden corners, it was rotten at the top. The men and women who had laughed behind my back today were thieves, every single one of them. By midnight, I had filled a notebook with my own notes. Each page carried a name, a weakness, a potential use. I wasn't just Kelly the dismissed assistant anymore. I was the custodian of the truth he had hidden, and with it, I could bring down every one of them if I chose. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. 50%, half the company. Enough to block them, but not enough to rule. For that, I still needed 51. Just 1 more percent. I thought about who might hold it. Small shareholders, family trusts, quiet voices who never spoke at meetings. Somewhere out there was someone with the power to tip the scale, someone who could make me unstoppable. And now I had something else to offer, not just a vision of loyalty to the late CEO, but the promise of exposing corruption so deep it could destroy reputations overnight. The thought didn't comfort me, it terrified me. because I knew the risk. If they discovered what I had, they wouldn't hesitate to silence me. They had already erased me from the company. Erasing me from the world wouldn't be much harder. But then I remembered his words again, whispered the day he handed me the folder. "Don't be afraid, Keely. They will never see you coming." I smiled for the first time that night. A small, quiet smile, the kind that carries more resolve than joy. They thought I was invisible. And for now, I would let them keep thinking that. But the truth was simple. I wasn't just holding half their empire. I was holding the evidence that could burn it to the ground. And when the time came, I wouldn't just take my rightful place. I would make sure every one of them paid for the arrogance they had shown today. The city outside was asleep, but I wasn't tired. Not anymore. I gathered the documents, slid them back into the leather folder, and locked it in the drawer by my bed. Tomorrow, I would begin searching for that extra 1%. Tomorrow, the quiet assistant they had dismissed would start becoming something else, something they couldn't laugh at. Monday morning began with the kind of quiet that feels like the world itself is holding its breath. I woke before the alarm, long before the city outside my window stirred to life. For a while, I just lay there, staring at the pale ceiling, letting the realization sink deeper into me. Today, I would stop being invisible. Today, the game would finally shift. I dressed with care, not ostentatiously, but deliberately. A dark tailored suit, a clean blouse, shoes polished until they reflected the light. I tied my hair back tightly, leaving nothing loose, nothing uncertain. I had been dismissed as a girl, a secretary, a shadow in the corner. They would not dismiss me today. The leather bag was heavier than usual as I slung it over my shoulder. Inside it rested the documents I had spent the weekend reviewing again and again until I could almost recite each clause by heart. 50% transferred to me by the late CEO, my mentor, the man they had all pretended to mourn. And the other 1%, the quiet, almost invisible stake I had held for years. That last part still made me smile. They had never known years ago. After proving myself in ways that no one else seemed to notice, he had insisted on transferring me a tiny stake. "Just 1%?" he had said, with that rare flicker of warmth in his voice. "It won't make you rich, but it will make sure you always have a seat at the table, even if they don't want to see you there." At the time, I thought it was a gesture, a token of recognition for my loyalty. I hadn't understood its weight, not until now. Now, with his last gift of 50% added to that one, I held 51%. The line between defense and power, between victim and victor. I walked into headquarters with measured steps, the kind that echoed across the marble floor. A few employees glanced at me in surprise, some even whispering. They had expected me gone for good, erased like a note crumpled and thrown into the trash. But I wasn't gone. I was here. And the leather bag on my shoulder carried the weight of their future. The boardroom loomed ahead, its glass doors already closed. I could see their silhouettes through the frosted panels, Caldwell leaning forward in her pearls, Ellis gesturing with his usual arrogance, Grayson sitting stiff as stone. Their laughter seeped faintly through the glass, low and self-satisfied. They hadn't noticed me yet. I pushed the doors open. Silence. Every head turned toward me, expressions flickering from annoyance to amusement. "Keely," Grayson said after a pause, his voice clipped, precise. "I believe there's been some confusion. This is a board meeting. You were dismissed." I finished for him, my tone calm. "Yes, I remember." A ripple of soft laughter spread around the table. Ellis leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Then why are you here? Looking for your severance check?" I set the leather bag on the table and began pulling out the documents, one by one. I arranged them in front of me, slowly, deliberately, letting the sound of paper against wood fill the silence. "I'm here," I said, lifting my gaze to meet theirs, "because, as of this morning, I own 51% of this company." For a moment, there was nothing but stillness. Then, inevitably, laughter. Genuine, unrestrained laughter. Caldwell pressed a hand against her pearls, chuckling as though I had told the most absurd joke she had ever heard. Ellis nearly doubled over, shaking his head. "This is priceless," he said. 51%? You? That's impossible. I slid the first document across the table. The official transfer of 50%, signed and sealed by the late CEO himself. Their laughter faltered, though a few still smirked, waiting for me to stumble. Then I placed the second file down, proof of my original 1%, held quietly for years, registered under my name. Their smirks vanished. Caldwell's hand stilled against her pearls. Grayson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, scanning the seal, the dates, the notarization. Ellis's smirk collapsed into something uglier, his lips curling as if the paper itself had betrayed him. That's not possible," Caldwell said, her voice sharper now. "You couldn't have." "I could," I cut in, my voice firm. "I did. I've held 1% for years. It wasn't much on its own, not enough to threaten anyone, so none of you paid attention. None of you cared. But with the late CEO's final transfer, it became 51. Majority ownership." The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the sound of someone shifting uncomfortably in their chair. Grayson cleared his throat. "Even if this were true." It is true," I interrupted, "and you know it. You can check the shareholder registry yourself. As of Friday, my ownership is formal, legal, and complete." 51%. Ellis slammed a hand against the table. "This is outrageous. Ownership doesn't mean control. We are the board. We make the decisions here." My phone rang. The sound was sharp, slicing through the tension like a blade. Every eye turned toward me. I glanced at the screen and saw the name of our lead investor flashing. Slowly, deliberately, I answered. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I'm here with the board now." "Yes, I've reviewed the latest reports. I agree, stability is essential moving forward. You have my assurance as majority shareholder. From this point forward, I'll be overseeing decisions personally." I could feel their eyes burning into me as I spoke. The voice on the other end, once dismissive of me in meetings, once unwilling even to shake my hand, was now deferential, respectful. They weren't speaking to an assistant anymore. They were speaking to the owner. "Thank you," I said finally, ending the call. I slipped the phone back into my bag, the silence in the room stretching like a taut wire. I gathered the documents again, stacking them neatly, sliding them back into the leather folder. My movements were calm, unhurried, every gesture deliberate. "I'll give you time to come to terms with the new reality," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "But make no mistake, the days of treating me as invisible are over. From now on, you answer to me." I stood, smoothed my jacket, and turned toward the door. For a moment, no one spoke. The mighty board, the people who had laughed behind my back, the ones who had dismissed me as nothing, sat frozen, their faces pale, their confidence shattered. Then I walked out. The echo of my heels on the marble floor followed me down the hallway, sharp and steady. I didn't need to look back to know what I was leaving behind. Disbelief, fear, and the dawning realization that the girl they had underestimated for years now held their fate in her hands. I had been their victim, their shadow, their joke. Now I was their owner. And this was only the beginning. I had expected silence after the board meeting, but silence was never their style. They thrived on schemes, on whispered alliances, on the belief that paper and signatures could bend reality to their will. So when the summons arrived 2 days later, a legal notice delivered to my office by a trembling clerk who wouldn't even meet my eyes, I wasn't surprised. The board had launched its counterattack. The claim was as crude as it was predictable, that the CEO had not been of sound mind when he signed the transfer documents. They alleged that his health had been failing, that he had acted under undue influence, that his signature was invalid. In short, they wanted the courts to strip me of my 50%, leaving me once again with only that modest 1%, a voice, but not a vote. For an hour, I sat at my desk, staring at the notice, letting the weight of it settle. They thought they were clever, that they had found the perfect angle to undermine me. But what they didn't know was that he had anticipated this too. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer. "They've made their move," I said. Her voice came back sharp and calm. "Let them!" We've been ready for weeks. By Friday morning, we were seated in the marble corridors of the courthouse, the kind of place where everything smells faintly of paper and polish. The board's lawyers, a team of expensive suits with silver hair and sharper tongues, strutted past us with smug smiles. I caught Caldwell among them, her pearls gleaming, her eyes glinting with anticipation. She leaned close as she passed, her voice low enough for only me to hear. "Enjoy your last days as a pretender, Keeley. This will all be over soon." I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because on the table before us sat a thick folder my lawyer had prepared weeks earlier, at my mentor's request. Inside were medical certificates confirming his fitness, notarized statements from doctors, and even a video recording of him signing the transfer. His voice firm, his words precise, his mind unmistakably clear. When the hearing began, the board's lawyers thundered about responsibility, about incapacity, about the sanctity of corporate governance. They painted me as an opportunist, a manipulator, a secretary who had seized her chance at the expense of a dying man. I sat there, still, silent, letting them spin their narrative. Let them believe their words had weight. Then my lawyer stood. She was younger than most in the room, but her voice carried the kind of authority that made even judges listen. She laid the medical certificates on the table one by one, her tone measured, deliberate. "As you can see, Your Honor, the late CEO had a clean bill of health, annual physical, neurological evaluation, both within weeks of the transfer, signed by specialists with no financial connection to the company." The judge nodded, flipping through the documents. "And here," she continued, sliding forward another stack, "are the notarized confirmations. Independent witnesses present at the signing. No duress, no hesitation. Every requirement of the law fulfilled." The board's lawyers shifted in their seats, their confidence faltering. Finally, she opened a laptop and pressed play. On the screen, my mentor appeared, seated at his desk, speaking directly to the camera. His voice was steady, his gaze clear. "I, Richard Hale," he said, his tone unmistakable, "do hereby confirm the transfer of 50% of my shares to Kelly Grant. This is my decision, freely made, and it reflects my confidence in her ability to safeguard the company's future. Should there be any doubt, let this recording serve as proof." The courtroom was silent. The only sound was his voice, echoing from beyond the grave, cutting through every argument they had made. When the video ended, my lawyer closed the laptop with a soft click. "The defense rests," she said simply. The judge leaned back, his expression unreadable. "We'll reconvene in 2 weeks for deliberation," he announced. I stood, gathering my bag, and glanced across the aisle. The board members sat frozen, their smugness drained away. Caldwell's pearls no longer gleamed. They looked like chains around her neck. Ellis glared at me with undisguised hatred. Grayson's face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he gathered his papers. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. Outside, the cameras were waiting. Reporters shouted questions, flashes lit the steps. I said nothing as I passed through the crowd, but I could feel the shift already. The narrative was no longer theirs to control. That afternoon, I met with the investors. The conference room was full, the air heavy with tension. These were the people who had funded expansions, who had trusted the company with millions, who were now watching nervously as the board tore it apart in their greed. I knew I had to give them something more than documents and signatures. I had to give them a reason to believe in me. I stood at the head of the table, the city skyline behind me, and spoke clearly. "I know what you've heard. I know you've seen the headlines. But let me be clear. The company is not leaderless, and it is not collapsing. What you saw in court today was desperation, not governance. They are clinging to power, while I am focused on the future. I clicked the remote, and the screen lit with slides I had prepared in my rented office over the weekend. Financial charts, projections, a restructuring plan. This is our current state, I said, showing the rising debts, the bloated expenses, the reckless bonuses. A murmur ran through the room. They had suspected, but now they saw it in black and white. And this, I continued, flipping to the next slide, is how we move forward. Cost containment, reallocation of resources to profitable divisions, transparency in executive compensation, a full audit of contracts, and above all, stability. No more chaos, no more self-interest at the top. Professional management, accountable leadership. I spoke for nearly an hour, outlining every step, every safeguard, every measure I would implement. I didn't shout, I didn't beg. I laid out the facts, the plan, the path forward. When I finished, I set down the remote and met their eyes one by one. You trusted this company once. I am asking you to trust it again, not because of promises, but because of proof. I hold 51%. The board cannot override me. The only question is whether we rebuild together or whether we let their arrogance destroy everything. The silence stretched. Then, one by one, heads nodded. The lead investor, the same one who had called me during the board meeting, leaned forward. You have our support, he said simply. Relief washed through me, not in waves, but in a steady calm. This was what mattered, not their sneers, not their legal tricks, but this, the future. As the investors filed out, shaking my hand, I caught a glimpse of myself in the glass wall. The same face that had once stood invisible in the back row of a cathedral, the same hands that had once trembled when told to leave. But the woman looking back at me now was different. She was steady, certain. The board thought they could erase me with papers and lies, but I had papers too, and truth, and numbers, and the one thing they had never considered, foresight. When the door closed behind the last investor, I sat alone for a moment, letting the silence settle. The war wasn't over, but the balance had shifted. And for the first time, I wasn't just fighting back. I was winning. The morning after the investors' meeting, I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating against the nightstand. Dozens of notifications filled the screen. Headlines, messages, missed calls. At first, my pulse quickened. For one sickening moment, I thought the court had somehow reversed itself overnight, that the shares had been stripped from me in some clandestine move. But when I opened the first article, I saw the truth. Forgery, fraud, manipulation. The board had found its new weapon. The newspapers carried it in bold fonts. Assistant turned pretender. Questions arise over Hale's final signature. Inside, the story was full of insinuations, not facts. Anonymous sources claimed the documents transferring shares to me were fakes, that they had been produced after his death, that I had somehow tricked him into signing while he was too weak to understand. Every paragraph dripped with malice. They used words like mysterious, questionable, suspect. They painted me as an opportunist, a nobody who had risen from obscurity by deceiving a dying man. I scrolled through them in silence, my hands steady, my chest strangely calm. They thought these words would break me. They thought I would panic, lash out, defend myself in front of cameras. But I remembered what my mentor had told me once. Never waste time fighting ghosts. They vanish when faced with real work. I set the phone down. If the board wanted to shout to the world, let them. I would answer with action. That afternoon, the investors gathered again. This time, the room was more crowded, the air heavier. Their faces were sharper, tense. I knew the headlines had reached them too. I knew they had questions. The lead investor leaned forward, fingers steepled. Keeley, he said slowly, you've secured the shares, you've presented a plan, and in principle, we support you. But support isn't eternal. Stability has to be visible. The company cannot survive weeks of rumor and paralysis. You must act, and you must act quickly. I nodded. I understand. He studied me for a moment, searching for cracks. Then you know what that means. You can't leave the same people at the helm while they attack you in the press. The composition of the board has to change. Permanently, there it was, spoken aloud. The thought that had burned in me since the funeral, the step I had rehearsed in my mind but hadn't yet dared to take. I met his gaze steadily. It will, I said. That evening, alone in my rented office, I spread the documents across the desk. Draft resolutions, legal templates, prepared quietly by my lawyer in anticipation of this very moment. On the surface, the board was still intact. 12 directors who had spent years building walls of arrogance around themselves. But with 51%, I had the authority to tear those walls down. Outside, the city buzzed with speculation. Journalists called my phone, left messages, begged for statements. Talk shows debated whether I was a fraud or a genius. Anonymous voices on social media claimed to know me, each telling their own fabricated version of who I was. I ignored them all. I didn't have time for shadows. Instead, I read through the resolutions again, line by line. The language was clinical, precise. Effective immediately, the following members of the board of directors are hereby removed. I whispered the names as I went: Caldwell, Ellis, Grayson. Each syllable felt like lifting a weight from my chest. Still, doubt flickered. These people were powerful, entrenched. Removing them would not erase their influence. They would fight harder, scream louder, try to claw their way back by any means necessary. But then I remembered the cathedral, the coffin, the way they had whispered while pretending to mourn. I remembered their laughter when they dismissed me, their sneers when they thought I had no weapon left. And suddenly, my hand was steady again. I signed the first resolution. My pen cut across the paper with quiet finality. Then the second, and the third. By the time I finished, my signature glistened on every page. 12 directors reduced to 5. A new board, leaner, cleaner, chosen from senior managers who still cared about the company's survival rather than their own pockets. The legal authority was mine, the documents airtight. I stacked them neatly, slid them into an envelope, and sealed it. Tomorrow, they would be filed with the registry. Tomorrow, the circle would break. When I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion washed over me. Not the exhaustion of fear, but of release. For years, I had sat in their shadow, taking notes, staying silent, letting them treat me as invisible. And now, with a few strokes of a pen, I had redrawn the map. The next morning, the documents were delivered. My lawyer accompanied them, her face calm, but her eyes glinting with the kind of satisfaction only a strategist knows. By noon, the registry had confirmed receipt. The filings were public, irreversible. Caldwell, Ellis, Grayson, all of them were gone. The press reacted instantly. New headlines screamed, "Shock shakeup at Hale Industries. Board members removed in overnight move." Reporters swarmed the headquarters, demanding answers, desperate for quotes. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded. And still, I said nothing. I walked past them with the same calm steps I had walked into the cathedral with, into the boardroom, into every room where they had underestimated me. The noise swirled around me, accusations, demands, threats, but none of it mattered, because the only sound that mattered now was the quiet click of the registry's stamp, confirming what I already knew. The company had a new reality. By evening, the calls from investors began again. Not questions this time, not doubts. Promises, support, relief. "You've proven you can act," the lead investor said. "That's all we needed to see." For the first time since this war began, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. Not victory, not yet, but certainty. The rumors would fade, the headlines would change, the board's whispers would dissolve into irrelevance. Because while they shouted at ghosts, I had written the future in ink. The courthouse smelled of old wood and paper dust, the kind of place where power didn't roar. It whispered in filings and signatures, in the measured tone of a judge reading words that could shatter empires. I sat at the long wooden table, my lawyer beside me, and tried to appear calm. My hands rested on the surface, fingers loosely interlaced, though underneath, I could feel the faint tremor of adrenaline pulsing through me. Across from us, the board's lawyers looked smug, their papers stacked high, their expressions sharp with expectation. Caldwell sat in the gallery, pearls gleaming, her lips pressed into a smile that was more sneer than comfort. Ellis leaned back in his seat, arms folded, eyes glinting with the kind of arrogance only someone who had never truly lost could maintain. Grayson sat stiff and silent, his gaze fixed on the judge, unwilling to meet mine. The board had filed for an injunction to freeze my rights as majority shareholder, claiming irregularities in the transfer. They had hoped the court would suspend my authority until a full trial could be conducted, leaving them free to maneuver in the shadows, to erode my position before I could act. It was a smart tactic. If I were them, I might have tried the same. The judge entered, robes flowing, gavel striking once. The room quieted instantly. He glanced over the papers, then raised his eyes to the board's lawyers. "You are asking the court," he said, his voice steady, "to suspend the rights of the registered majority shareholder pending further review." On what grounds? Their lead attorney stood, smoothing his suit jacket. "Your Honor, the documents transferring 50% of Hale Industries to Miss Grant are, at best, questionable. There are concerns about the late CEO's state of mind, as well as allegations of manipulation. Until these issues are resolved, it would be reckless to allow her unchecked control." The judge nodded slowly, then turned to my lawyer. "Your response?" My lawyer rose, her voice calm, firm. "Your Honor, the documents are valid. We have already submitted medical certifications confirming the late CEO's capacity, notarized witness statements, and a video recording of the signing itself. Moreover, Miss Grant has held 1% of the company for years, a fact well documented and undisputed. That gives her 51% majority ownership. Suspending her rights would not preserve order. It would undermine the law." A murmur ran through the gallery. Even some of the journalists scribbling notes seemed surprised by the certainty in her tone. The judge considered this, tapping his pen lightly against the bench. The silence stretched, heavy as stone. Finally, he spoke. "The court rules that the status quo must be preserved. Until the full trial, no decisions shall be made by the board without the consent of the majority shareholder, Miss Grant. This ruling is effective immediately." For a moment, the words seemed to hang in the air, echoing through the wood-paneled chamber. Then they landed like a hammer. I exhaled slowly. The strategy they had so carefully built, to strip me of authority, to stall me until I collapsed, shattered in a single sentence. Across the room, Caldwell's smile vanished. Ellis slammed a fist against the table, muttering something vicious under his breath. Grayson's face tightened, pale and drawn. They couldn't speak. They couldn't move. For the first time, they had no power. The gavel struck again. Court adjourned. I stood, gathering my bag, and turned toward the gallery. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but their voices blurred into background noise. I walked past the directors without acknowledging them. They weren't worth my words. Not anymore. That same afternoon, I convened a board meeting. Not as an observer, not as the shadow in the corner, but as chair. The boardroom looked the same. The glossy mahogany table, the city skyline stretching beyond the glass walls, the leather chairs aligned in perfect symmetry. But the atmosphere was different. I could feel it the moment I entered. At the head of the table, a new chair had been placed, slightly larger, its back higher. My chair. The old directors filed in first. Caldwell, pearls dulled under the fluorescent light, avoided my gaze. Ellis slouched into his seat, radiating contempt but saying nothing. Grayson moved stiffly, as though every step cost him something. Their silence was louder than their usual mockery, a silence forced by the court's ruling, a silence that betrayed the truth. They could do nothing without me. Then the door opened again. 3 figures stepped inside. The new independent directors. They weren't allies in the personal sense. They weren't friends. They were professionals, each with reputations built on competence rather than politics. I had chosen them deliberately. A respected financial analyst, a seasoned corporate lawyer, and a former regulator known for rooting out corruption. Their presence alone changed the balance in the room. Caldwell's eyes narrowed as they took their seats. Ellis muttered something under his breath, but even he didn't dare raise his voice. Grayson simply stared at the table, his knuckles white. I took my place at the head of the table. The leather was cool against my palms as I rested them on the armrest. For a moment, I let the silence stretch, let them feel the shift, let them understand that the world they knew had ended. Then I spoke. "This is the first meeting of Hale Industries under its new structure," I said calmly. "As of this morning, I am chair. 3 new independent directors have joined us, bringing with them expertise we need. From this point forward, decisions will be made in the best interests of the company, not personal ambition." No one interrupted. I glanced down the table at the familiar faces of my old opponents. "You may remain silent if you choose. You may resent what has happened. That is your right. But make no mistake, the era of arrogance, of self-dealing, of mocking the very company you were meant to serve, is over." Their silence held. Caldwell's hands tightened in her lap. Ellis's jaw twitched. Grayson stared blankly at his notes. I turned to the new directors. "You've seen the financials. You know the challenges. Stability must come first. Our investors demand it, and I will deliver it. There will be no chaos, no rumors, no reckless spending. From this day forward, transparency is policy." The financial analyst nodded. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. The regulator folded his hands neatly, expression unreadable. Professionals, every one of them. I felt the weight of the moment settle around me. For years, I had sat in this room as a shadow, taking notes no one read, watching men and women sneer while they carved up what my mentor had built. For years, I had been dismissed, underestimated, humiliated. And now, here I was, at the head of the table, their silence my victory, their resentment my proof. The meeting continued for hours. Reports were reviewed, motions discussed. But the details blurred because the real battle had already been won. Not in numbers, not in documents, but in silence. The silence of people who could no longer pretend I was invisible. When the meeting adjourned, I stood, gathering my notes. No one spoke as I left. The old directors sat frozen, their defeat etched into their faces. Outside, the city pulsed with noise, with headlines, with speculation. But none of it mattered. Because in that boardroom, for the first time, I had taken my place. And they knew it. The first official week of my chairmanship began before dawn. I arrived at headquarters while the city was still half asleep. The streets quiet, except for the hum of delivery trucks and the occasional bark of a dog. The glass tower loomed above me, sharp against the gray morning sky. For years, I had walked into this building as a shadow. Today, I walked in with a pen sharp enough to cut. By 8, the directors, executives, and senior managers had assembled in the boardroom. The air was tense, brittle. I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes tracking me as I placed my folder on the table and sat at the head. For a moment, no one spoke. Then I opened the folder and began. Item 1. Removal of Martin Ellis, Chief Operations Officer, effective immediately. A murmur swept the room. Ellis, seated halfway down the table, sprang to his feet. "This is outrageous! You can't—" "I can," I interrupted calmly. "And I will." Ellis has consistently obstructed oversight, misrepresented financial data, and engaged in hostile actions against the company's stability. His service ends today, gasps, whispers, faces pale and stunned. Ellis's expression twisted between rage and disbelief. "You'll regret this," he hissed. but I could see the fear under his bluster. Security had already been notified. 2 guards stepped inside, their presence quiet but unmistakable. Ellis froze, then shoved his papers into a briefcase with shaking hands. He stormed out without another word. The silence he left behind was thick, broken only by the sound of my pen scratching across the resolution document. His name crossed out. The first domino had fallen. Item 2, I continued. Executive compensation. Effective immediately, all bonus payments and discretionary incentives are frozen pending independent review. This time, the reaction was sharper. Caldwell stiffened, her pearls rattling against each other. Grayson opened his mouth, then shut it, remembering the court order. Others whispered furiously, but none dared speak aloud. I didn't pause. Item 3. A comprehensive audit, full examination of accounts, contracts, and compensation structures over the past 5 years. Independent auditors will begin this week. No exceptions, no delays. The murmur rose again, but I cut through it. Transparency is no longer optional. Those who have nothing to hide have nothing to fear. When I finished, I closed the folder and leaned back. The meeting continued with routine items, but no one cared. The real business had already been done. By noon, the news had spread. Headlines lit up the financial press. Shake-up at Hale Industries, COO removed, bonuses frozen, audit ordered. New chair moves swiftly to restructure leadership. Investors called within hours. Some were cautious, others curious, but most expressed relief. "It's decisive," the lead investor said in a televised statement. "It's exactly what the company needed." "We support Ms. Grant fully. It was the confirmation I needed. Public, undeniable, binding." By evening, the employees had heard too. I walked the halls quietly, hearing fragments of conversations. "Kaylee? That girl from admin?" someone whispered. "I thought she left," another said. "She's the chair now?" The chair? Their shock was almost comical. I had been invisible for so long that half of them barely remembered me. To them, I was the quiet figure in the corner, the one no one listened to, the one who blended into the background. Now, suddenly, I was their leader. Some looked at me with awe, others with suspicion, but all with curiosity. I saw it in their eyes. The question of whether I was strong enough to hold this position, whether I was more than just a shadow elevated by chance. That night, sitting alone in my office, the building dark around me, I allowed myself a rare smile. It wasn't joy. It was resolve. The company was changing, slowly, painfully, but changing. But with change came danger. The first threat arrived in the form of an envelope slipped under my office door. No name, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence written in block letters. "He didn't went of natural causes." My hands trembled slightly as I read it. The second came as a whisper, overheard in the hallway as I passed 2 junior staff. "They say the old man didn't collapse on his own." "That may be." Their voices dropped when they saw me, eyes wide with fear. The third came as a phone call, late at night. A distorted voice, almost a growl. "Stop digging, Kaylee. Stop before you end up like him." For a long time, I sat in the dark after that call, staring at the city lights. Was it true? Had my mentor, the man who had trusted me with everything, been taken from me not by fate but by them? Had his death been the first move in a strategy to seize control? I remembered his face in the video, his voice steady, his eyes clear as he confirmed the transfer. He knew, I thought. He knew they would come for him, and still he trusted me to finish what he started. Fear clawed at my chest, but alongside it grew something stronger. Anger, determination. If they thought threats would silence me, they had forgotten who I was. I had been invisible for years, underestimated, dismissed. I had survived their contempt. I would survive this too. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than ever. I placed the envelope with the threat into my desk drawer, not to hide it, but to remind myself. The stakes were real. This was no longer just about control of a company. It was about truth, about justice, about survival. As the sun rose over the skyline, I whispered the words that had carried me this far. We'll see each other again. And I knew. The real war had only just begun. The office was silent. The kind of silence that only comes long after the world has gone home, when even the hum of the elevators seems to disappear. I sat at my desk, the city lights spilling across the glass walls, watching my reflection in the darkened window. For the first time in months, I was truly alone. The papers from the day's meeting were still scattered across the table. Resolutions signed, orders issued, decisions made. Ellis was gone. Caldwell's influence broken. Grayson reduced to a footnote in the minutes. The company, my company now, had survived the storm. But as I sat there, I realized survival wasn't enough. I opened the drawer and pulled out the leather folder one last time. The folder that had changed everything. The one my mentor had pressed into my hands with those final words. "Keep this safe, Keeley. One day you'll need it." For weeks, I had treated it like a weapon. 50%, plus my one. The sword that cut down their arrogance. The shield that kept me standing when they tried to erase me. But now, staring at the embossed seal, I felt something shift inside me. He hadn't left it to me for revenge. He had left it to me because he trusted me. I thought of the years before, when I was nothing but a shadow in the back row. The ignored assistant, the extra seat, the one who fetched papers while others made decisions. I thought of the laughter, the condescension, the stolen credit, all the times I had been told without words that I didn't belong. And then I thought of him. The only one who had ever looked past the silence, the one who had seen something in me even I had forgotten, was there. His voice echoed in my memory. "They will underestimate you. That will be your greatest advantage." He had been right. The board had tried to erase me, and in doing so, they had delivered me to power. Their arrogance, their blindness, their greed. They had built the road I now walked. Every insult, every dismissal, every laugh behind my back had only carved me sharper. They had created the very force they now feared. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what revenge might look like. Public trials, ruined reputations, the sight of Caldwell's pearls dimmed in disgrace, Ellis begging for scraps of relevance, Grayson fading into obscurity. The picture was satisfying, intoxicating even, but then it dissolved. Because revenge was loud and loudness fades. True victory is quieter. It endures. Justice wasn't in destroying them. Justice was in preserving what they had tried to corrupt. Justice was in building a company worthy of the man who had trusted me with it. Justice was in showing every ignored voice, every underestimated girl in the back row, that silence could become power if you learned how to hold it. I opened my eyes. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass, pulsing with 1,000 lives, 1,000 ambitions, and for the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in. I felt like part of it. The threats still lingered. The anonymous envelope, the late-night calls, the whispered hints that my mentor hadn't collapsed on his own. I didn't know if the truth would ever fully emerge, or if the answers would remain buried under layers of polished lies. But I knew one thing. I would not be silenced by fear. I had already survived their attempts to erase me. I would survive this too. My phone buzzed with another message, a blocked number, another warning. I stared at it for a moment, then deleted it without reading further. I would not give them the satisfaction of my attention. My focus belonged elsewhere now. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Not the battles in court, not the fights with greedy directors, but the rebuilding. The quiet, steady work of reshaping the company into something that honored its legacy instead of feeding on it. I gathered the papers into neat stacks, my movements precise, almost ceremonial. Then I placed the leather folder back into the drawer and locked it. Not because I was hiding it, but because I no longer needed it as a weapon. Its purpose had been fulfilled. When I stood, the office felt different. Not lighter, not freer, but steadier, solid. I walked to the window and pressed my palm against the glass, feeling the faint chill seep into my skin. The city below was alive, unaware of the battles fought in this tower, unaware of the victories and the threats. And that was the point. The company existed not for boardroom wars, but for the people who relied on it: employees, clients, partners, families. They didn't care about the egos of directors or the whispers of scandals. They cared about stability. And I would give it to them. The future belonged to me now. But more importantly, it belonged to them. I turned off the lights, letting the room fall into shadow. My heels echoed softly across the marble as I walked toward the door. At the threshold, I paused, looking back one last time at the chair, the desk, the glass walls that had once caged me. No cage anymore, a vantage point. I whispered into the darkness, not for the board, not for myself, but for him. Your legacy is safe. I promise, then I left. The threats would come again, the doubts, the whispers, the attempts to frighten me back into invisibility. But I was no longer afraid, because true victory isn't loud. It doesn't shout. It stands quietly, unshaken, while the noise burns itself out. And that was what I intended to do. The company was mine, the future was mine, and I was ready.